Now before we start sewing the rest of our top together, this is when you need to check if you have made markings on your piece 4 and piece 5. So these are the first pieces that we started sewing with that we added interfacing to. So now that the interfacing is here, we need to make these markings. So I have not made mine, I'm going to do so now. So piece 5, I have a circle here at the top. I have a triangle here, and I have another circle at the center back. So I'm just using a pen to break open those little spots. And I'm going to quickly mark them using my little marker tool. Okay, and the triangle I can be kind of lazy with. It's like there. And I need to do that on both piece 5s. So that is just one. Now I have this one. I'm going to do the same thing. Mark the center back. My triangle's like here. And then mark this little point here. Okay, so that takes care of my 5s. And now I have piece 4. I'm going to do the same thing. Grab a pen and find all of the little marks. This one has a lot of different sized marks. Make sure that you're using the one that's for your size. All right. I have a triangle here. One spot here, one spot here. And then I need to do the same exact thing for the other piece. So just flipping it over. There's a dot here. There's a triangle about here. And then I have a dot here. Okay. Now the next part of the instructions has us stitching together piece 4. So I like to keep the pattern out for a reference here when I'm doing any kind of stitching on pieces like this that have lots of curves and things, and that's just helps me make sure that I'm stitching things correctly. So I know that when I stitch this, I'm going to have right sides together, so I'll go ahead and match up the right sides together. So that's what that looks like. And then I'm going to use my pattern piece as a frame of reference, lay it out and make sure it looks the same. Okay, and then you can check your piece here and check your notches. There's a notch here, 2 notches here, a notch here, and a notch here. So we're looking at the correct layout that they're using the pattern, and we're going to stitch this seam. So this seam goes together, and you're going to stitch from that large circle to the end and not above it. So I'll just put in a pin here quickly. We can stitch this on the machine just as quickly. So starting at that dot in a 5/8 seam, stitch, back stitch. I'll do it a couple of times there just to make it stronger, and then stitch to the bottom and back stitch again. Okay, so that part is done. Now we open up our instructions. And now we need to stitch 1 back section 5 to 4. So open out 4. And once again, you can keep this as a reference. And you have piece 5. Piece 5 has a center back marking, and your 2 notches should match up. So if I lay this out and just double check it, I can see that this matches the layout here. So this is going to get sewn here. So to the side that has 2 notches gets sewn to piece 4, which also has 2 notches. So now these get sewn together. 5/8, stitch, back stitch, and stitch to the bottom, and back stitch again. Now we need to attach the other piece 5. So now we have a 5, 4, 4. We have one more piece 5, and we know that we need the side that has 2 notches. So we're just going to use our piece 5 as a reference tool. This is correct, it all fits. So we know that this seam gets sewn to this seam. Once again, 5/8, stitch, back stitch, then back stitch again. Now before we go any further, we need to go to the ironing board and we need to press open all of these seams. So let's go do that now. Sorry guys, I didn't realize in that last shot that my camera was a little bit higher, so I wanted to cover how these get sewn together one more time just in case you needed it. So this middle section are our piece 4s. So both piece 4s got sewn together on the side that has 3 notches and your dot, and you were just sewing from the dot down to the bottom. Then using that piece, which has 2 notches on the side, you can match that up with your piece 5, which also has 2 notches at the side. So these should match up like this, and that's how you know to sew them together. So you have both your 4s, one piece 5 over here on the right, and one piece 5 on the other side on the left. So now you press the center, and then one more side seam. Okay, so once you have pressed everything open, you'll also want to take your scissors and trim out any excess thread that you have. So trim all of these out and then take this back to your sewing machine and we will begin stitching this to our actual jumpsuit. One thing I want to do quickly that's actually not specified in the instructions is I want to finish the edge of this long piece, and that just helps the interfacing stay in place as you wear this and wash it. And to do that, I'm going to use a special stitch on my machine. For me, it's number 10, and that just creates a zigzag stitch that also has a straight line, and I will do that throughout the entire hem of this piece, and it's just to keep that interfacing in place through wear and tear and life. So your machine should have some kind of stitch that's an equivalent to this, and you can decide if you want to do this or not. It's very easy. The machine should do most of the work for you. You just kind of have to guide it along. And don't stitch too quickly, because sometimes if you stitch too quickly the stitch will break, especially if it's a decorative stitch. Even better is if you have a serger. A serger would do this in probably maybe a minute. I wish I had my serger here, but I don't, so I have to do it this way. But if you have a serger, definitely serge the end of this. I plan on wearing this jumpsuit a lot, which means it's also going to be washed a lot. So I want it to be strong. wondering why I didn't just fold this up 5/8 and then turn it in to make a nice seam like we did on the leg, it's because oftentimes if you do that with interfacing, the seam will show through the fabric, or it will create an unattractive line when you're wearing it. So you want to avoid folding excessive pieces of fabric if it's going to be underneath a thin layer, because it will show. Another thing that's good to do before you start stitching like this with a decorative stitch is to check your bobbin and make sure that you have a lot of thread, because this will eat up a lot of thread. But I still think it's worth having it. Like I said before, you don't want to rush this, because if you rush it, it will probably break, or it could even skip a stitch. If you do this on your machine and you find that you're going slow and you're still breaking stitches, that would be a good time to check your needle to make sure that your needle is still sharp enough. If you're having problems, sometimes you just need a new needle. I think after I finish this jumpsuit, it will have been my third project with this needle, so I will definitely have to throw this one out and switch it with something else. Okay, and we're finally at the end. I'll try to show you what mine looks like. So it's hard to see mine because it's pink and it's on white. But this is what it does. It's just a pretty finishing stitch that will hold everything together. So this is not in the directions, but I do highly recommend adding it if your machine has a setting that allows you to add a decorative stitch. Alright, we finished making the edge nice and neat. So now we're actually going to attach this to our jumpsuit. So what you'll want to do, I'm going to go ahead and just move this off to the side. And this is my jumpsuit. So go ahead and lay it so that the front is on top, and the front is the section that you sewed almost all the way to the top to. The back has the sections that you did the 5/8 inch seam on. So that should be in back, and you should have the front on top, and you're just going to take your facing and place that on top, and we're going to start pinning these sections together. Now if you look at the pattern, we are on step 9, and we're going to be sewing our underarm and then also sewing the sides up to the shoulder. So I would also recommend, you're going to be stitching in the front also, so I would recommend stitching the front first, and then we'll go ahead and understitch that. Because of the way this pattern is built, they have you doing all of these stitches and then doing the understitching. I actually think it's easier to do sections, do the understitching, and then do another section. And I realize that may not make sense right now, so we can do that together. So right now just focus on sewing the front together. So this is my front section. The first thing you'll want to do is match up your front seam. So match up the seam first. Okay, and go ahead and pin that. This is one of the sections where you can't use too many pins. It's good to use pins. Then go ahead and match up the top. And put a pin in there as well. The top of the shoulder, I should say. Do the same thing with the other side. Match up the top. And then you're just going to fit in the rest of the fabric. There's also a notch to match up. So put in as many pins as you need to feel comfortable. I'm just going to do 3 here in between the shoulder to the notch. Alright, and the same thing for the other side. Okay. And then we're going to stitch that section together. So you can go ahead and run this part through the sewing machine. You're doing that same 5/8 inch stitch. Back stitch and continue on. Now be careful when you get to the middle. Just make sure everything is laying flat. And you're basically going to sew straight down, keeping that 5/8 inch seam until you hit the center of the seam in the middle. So stitch slowly if you need to, if it makes you feel more comfortable. And stitch until you reach that middle seam. Alright, then you're going to pick up the foot and turn your fabric. I'm just checking my seam here. Looks like I need to go one more stitch in. So one more stitch. Oh, 2, sorry. There we go. I wasn't quite at the seam yet. Now I am. Then you'll line up this fabric with the 5/8 inch marker there and start stitching. Then when you get to the top, understitch. Or not, sorry, don't understitch, backstitch. Okay, now to talk about the understitching. Understitching is something that you do to keep your fabric in place as you are wearing a garment. So you don't want the facing to pop out because it's unattractive and it doesn't look good. So what you do with the understitching is, let's say you have the seam. This is what we're about to stitch. I'll go to the top so it's easier to see it. So this is the seam that we just stitched all this. So you're going to open this out and you're going to take your interfacing and your facing selvages and you're going to push them towards the interfacing, okay? And what you're going to do is you're going to do a small stitch through here all the way down, and that's called understitching, and that is to keep this from popping out whenever you wear the garment. So go ahead and push the selvages towards your interfacing, both sides, then flip it over. You're going to be stitching on the right side of the fabric, and you're going to be stitching on top of the interfacing section. And this stitch doesn't have to be perfect because no one will see it. It will be on the inside of your jumpsuit, but you want to stitch it pretty close to the original stitching line that you made. So our original stitching line is right here, and we're going to stitch about right here just to keep that fabric in place. So go ahead and do that, and keep your fingers underneath the whole time you're stitching this because you want to keep pulling the selvages this way towards your interfacing and make sure that they don't pop out. So I'm just feeling underneath to make sure everything's going the correct way. Go ahead and put that through there so it doesn't get knotted up. And the reason I'm telling you to feel underneath is because it does take a little bit of sewing experience before you can start to feel the thickness of fabric. After you've been sewing a while, you won't have to keep your hands underneath because you'll be able to tell by where you're holding the fabric if the selvages are where they're supposed to be or not. I can usually tell pretty quickly if something has flipped up somewhere that it's not supposed to be. Now this section in particular is tricky. We're getting close to the middle front here. Alright, so be really careful when you get to the front. What you'll actually probably want to do is just stitch slightly closer to it, then back stitch, and then actually pull the needle out and go ahead and break the thread there and then start on the other side. It will be very difficult for you to just stitch all of this together because it's so thick, so don't worry about doing that. Just stitch as far as you can. So now we're on the other side, and the closest place that I can pull the selvages out and start to stitch them down feels like it's about here, and I can feel underneath that that's about the earliest place I can start. So I'm just going to hold those selvages underneath, stitch, back stitch, and then keep sewing. Just filling underneath to make sure that the fabric is still going this way. Okay. So now, whenever we wear this, all of this material will get flipped to the inside and it's going to end up making a very nice V for us. Okay? So just check on the inside now and make sure nothing looks strange or wonky. Alright, everything looks good here. Now we'll just move on to the next section. This is the front understitching. Now you can actually turn your fabric, the interfacing part, to the inside to actually see what understitching does, and you can feel how it holds everything in place. Now what we need to do so that we can avoid puckers and things like this, you can see how the fabric is wanting to slightly pucker. You flip it back to the inside, and then you're going to take your scissors and just trim some of this out. So the first thing that I would tell you to do is actually trim out the excess fabric. Do this carefully because you don't want to cut through any of your material. Or I should say you don't want to cut through the right side of your material, your nice fabric, but you want to cut out all of that excess. Do it as slowly as you need to feel comfortable. And once you've done that, flip it to the outside again and take another look at it. Or flip it to the inside, I should say. Flip your interfacing to the inside and take a look at it again. Okay, that's already better. The center is what matters the most. So let's take a look at the center. See how there's still just a slight pucker there. So what you want to do is flip back to the inside again and go to the center. And then what we can do to ease some of that is actually cut into the selvages some more here. So right at the center here where I have this extra fabric, I'm just going to do a tiny little cut there. And that should allow this to flow a little better. Keep in mind, some of this pucker will also come out whenever you give the garment a good pressing. So you just want to make sure there's nothing really obvious. Okay, so then lay it out as if you were actually wearing it. Now if I pull this out like I'm actually wearing it, I can still see I have a tiny bit of a pucker right here. So turn it back to the inside again. You basically just want to keep cutting into that until it relaxes and it lays a little better. Just make sure that you're only cutting in to the inside sections and not actually the right side of your fabric. You do not want to do that. That already looks better. Okay, so you'll have to play with that because depending on the fabric and the size and how tightly you sewed things, you may have to cut a little bit more or a little bit less. It really just depends. And remember that whenever you press this, a lot of that will come out, so don't overcut. Just cut enough so that it lays flat. So this is what you want at the end.